Allegiance, please stand for the I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Yes,
That's the agenda for it.
call or roll call. Sorry, on my right.
Councilperson Brent Fire.
Mayor Jimmy John King.
Councilperson Craig Anderson.
Councilperson Jeremiah Oljan.
EDA Mark Luciano.
Josh is telecommunicating with us on there. He just called himself in here. Under motions and general business, tonight we're going to be talking about tax abatement for Flats 55. Mike Bubani of David Brown Public Financial Advisors will be attending our meeting to discuss the tax abatement for Flats 55. Mike, if you'd like to step up, we'll give you the podium and you can let us know what's going on.
Well, good evening, and thank you for holding this special work meeting and inviting me to come along. There's a variety of documents, I think, that were included in your packets. I'll be speaking to some of those tonight. But first, just to kind of lay out exactly what's going on, is the city's been approached by a developer, as you know, to invest probably $8 or $9 million in constructing a 55-unit multifamily building. They've come forward asking for a variety of types of assistance, some of which has already been at least preliminarily approved. For instance, you know, the adding an additional floor in terms of height requirement, limiting how much parking and those sorts of things. But they're requesting more. And usually when we see assistance requests come in, it's one of two things. It's either going to be, hey, we need help with our cash flow in the future. So we're looking for sort of an annual contribution of some sort. Or what we have here, it's an upfront issue. They think they'll cash flow the project just fine. What they need help with is coming up with the money up front to make the project a go. So they have their own money and investors involved. They've gone to the bank, and the bank has provided staff with some preliminary feedback that they are willing to fund the project. But there's still a bit of a gap, and they've identified $500,000 as their gap. Now, some of that is being handled through sort of non-cash assistance. One item would be, for instance, the park's dedication fee, which is figured on being $27,000 and change. That would not be waived, but it would be deferred under the initial discussions with the developer until one of two things happens. Either A, the project becomes 80% occupied, in which case they'll be cash flowing nicely, they can pay for that park's dedication fee. Or if they ask to develop a second phase, because there are additional buildings planned in the future. So if they have the money to go ahead and ask for approval on a second building, then obviously they have the money to pay your park's dedication fee at that time too. Also included to reduce from this $500,000 was if the city indeed approves lesser parking restrictions, that's going to save them quite a bit of money in terms of what they have to shell up front. But we're still short. And so that's the main crux why I'm here. $280,000 is the figure. So how could we go about providing the developers $280,000 in assistance? So we have to think about what's our statutory authority to assist projects like these. Usually, if someone approaches me with something like this, right off the bat, I'm talking about a tax increment financing district like we did for Geotech. But in this case, since it's housing, it would come with income limits. And they would have to reserve a certain number of units for folks that meet those income guidelines, which may or may not be marketable in their mind. So they wanted to avoid income limits. So we shifted from tax increment financing to tax abatement as a tool. And for the public that may be listening online, let's not get too bogged down with the terms tax increment financing and tax abatement. What we're talking about is property taxes. It's just how we package it up is all we're talking about in terms of differences. So with tax abatement, unlike TIF, this would be a city alone sort of contribution. The county and school are not involved. Whereas the TIF district, like we did with geotech, there would be county and school taxes involved in that. So while we don't get those additional dollars, it does allow for the developer to build this thing without income limits, so that's the benefit there. How do we come up with the $280,000 up front? Well, one way to do it is to dip into your reserves. Just go ahead and pick a fund, one of the city's funds, and shell out $280,000 when the time comes. And then hope that when the building is built and the taxes are in, you repay that fund. Or you can finance the $280,000. That's one of the proposals in front of you tonight, is that if you would like to finance that, Minnesota Rural Water Association has direct bank placement bond programs with low issuance costs. And so I suggested to staff that if the city chose to finance that, you ought to use that program because it'll be a lot less costly than a conventional public sale. Staff has reached out to the local banks to see that if the city did indeed decide to pursue that route, if they would be interested in purchasing that bond and to provide me an indicative interest rate. And the banks have got back to us. One of them is interested in it, and they have provided me an indicative rate lower than what's in your packet. But the interest rate I put in your packet was high on purpose because I wanted to make sure that we designed this thing. We can always do less, but we can't do more. Now, the abatement itself, people might be thinking, okay, whether we use cash reserves or whether we issue bonds to provide this check for the developer, what does that mean to me? What does it mean to my taxes at home? And the answer is it should mean nothing, because the levies that will be designed to make the payments on the bonds are designed so that the levies are offset by the new tax base generated by the builder. So while you will see a levy increase in terms of your budget, it's also because your tax base as an overall city is going up, so the tax rate, all other things being equal, your tax rate would not increase. So basically you could argue we could do nothing and nobody's taxes would go up and you wouldn't have an apartment building, or you could go forward and you have an apartment building and nobody's taxes went up as a result. Okay. So we want to be able to argue that this cost is self-contained. In your packets, I did do a preliminary bond report. It's a spreadsheet document. Trying to find my copy of it. I just wanted to take you through it real quick. Do you all have access to that? It looks like this.
That, I don't.
It's not in our report.
Oh, shoot. Any chances of
Yep.
getting
Yeah,
it?
run them off quick.
I don't think that's one. I just have the summary and then
Oh, I beg your pardon. He's got a staple there.
Really
So-
quick, or just really quick while we're waiting, Mike is the city's representative, so he's helping our staff work through these guidelines, the outlines, the parameters that we're putting together for this. So, in other words, he's on our side
Correct.
as we review all this.
Yeah, I'm here to represent your interests, not the developers. As we're waiting for those copies to be made, I put together, I always do this as part of a project, as a bullet point list of items that you agree to and they agree to. So they agree to build the facility, they agree not to challenge their taxable valuation for the life of the contract, because if we're going to give them a tax benefit, we shouldn't let them argue about the valuation. They're going to agree that they can't sell the project without preliminary approval from you folks, although your approval will not be unreasonably withheld. They're going to indemnify the city for the project. What does that mean? That means when the project's being built and there's some guy on a ladder and he falls off, he's going to say, you know what, if the city had never done the abatement, I wouldn't have been on that ladder. I'm going to sue the city. Well, if they indemnify the city, that means that's not our problem, that's the developer's problem. They've agreed that if for some reason the valuation doesn't generate the tax abatement necessary to make the payments, either to replenish your funds or to make the bond payments, whichever route you decide, they will cover the shortfall on a personal guarantee. It's not a perfect protection, but it is something. Okay, so what's coming around, and this might illustrate how this works. The first page in the top left kind of shows the sources and uses. So there's the $280,000 that's needed to fund the gap. We have issuance costs associated with Minnesota Rural Water and setting up the abatement. But you'll notice there's something there called capitalized interest. That is not an issuance cost. What capitalized interest is, let's say they build the facility this year, which is the plan is to get started this year, and to be substantially complete sometime next year. We're not going to see the increase in that tax base for a couple years down the road. But if you issue debt, you're going to have to make some interest payments prior to that, and you're not going to have a revenue stream. And so we borrow extra money, and we put that in your debt service fund. It makes those payments for you. So you don't have to levy against residents. You don't levy until which time that building is up and part of the tax base. So to show how that's illustrated, if you go to the second page, you'll see the duration of this bond issue. It's a little over a 15-year term. And way over on the far right, you'll see something that says account balance. That would be the debt service fund. So the capitalized interest and the rounding figures would start in your account, and then you start making the payments using that cash. So you see the cash dwindle until it hits the tax base, at which time, with taxes payable 23, you would start the abatement levies, and then that will take over the payments from there. So what else did we do to design this thing to protect the city? Well, other than just the personal guarantee and them agreeing not to challenge their valuation, you don't actually cut them the check until which time the construction is over. We're not going to cut them a check today and then they don't build the building. We want to see the building up. So they know they have to fund construction. It would be, once it's complete, they would get the money. So that's one protection. The other thing is when we designed this in terms of how much money we could use to fill the gap at $280,000, we did it based on a 10-year abatement, not 15 years that you see here. And that's because I wanted to make sure that the revenues had a cushion. Just like when you go to the bank and you get a mortgage, they don't give you the full value. They want a cushion, same thing here. So while the tax abatements you see there in that $30,000 a year range, realistically this thing is going to produce about $40,000 a year in levy revenue. So you're going to have a $10,000 a year cushion as well. So all of those things were an attempt. Now that is still not a perfect protection. I can't get you a perfect protection, but that goes a long way in protecting the city. And as stated, the interest rate I'm showing you there is high. If we were to lower that interest rate, according to what one of the local banks responded to me in terms of an indicative rate, we'll probably be able to reduce that capitalized interest by a few $1,000s. So this borrowing would actually be smaller than shown. Okay. All right. Bill and Heather, anything that I haven't touched on that I should hit?
Mike addressed it, but the thing we liked best was that performance-based borrow, if you will. That stays consistent with what the EDA has done with their smaller versions of assistance when we've done match grants or things like that for Main Street. They always said performance had to be done first, then you got reimbursed. By having the building built, the performance is done, and now we've basically got, we refer to it as the security against the property. So eventually, even though if something happens, it might take time, it's still pledged to the city first. So we felt good about that.
I guess from there, I'll just take questions from the council and see if I can clear anything up that I wasn't clear on.
Council, got any questions for Mike? Josh, could you hear all that?
I heard it. Yep.
You got any questions?
I guess the length he was talking about 10 years, but the 14 year is what's listed in there. Is that just because they're going to be building in phases? Is that why they're lengthening that out?
He's got a question, I don't know if you heard it, Mike, it's about, he's kind of wondering, again, on the
length.
difference between the 15 and the 10 year, the way you were talking about.
Oh, sure. So The borrowing I've designed as 15 principal payments. Arguably, I could have done this as a 10 principal payment bond, but then your payments would have been just about exactly what we expect the abatement levy to be. The abatement levy is going to be 40 grand a year, and we could do that, but then you've got no cushion. So, if for some reason values come in lower than what we thought, you wouldn't have a cushion. So my idea was to stretch the financing those extra few years to lower the payment so that the annual revenue should exceed what the payment is, to just give you a cushion. Does that answer the question?
Does that answer you, Josh?
Yeah.
And also, Mike, I got one question. If, don't these abatements also work if it's paid up, if the 280 comes in, if the valuations go up quick enough, couldn't the abatement be paid quicker than 10 years actually?
Yes. So this borrowing would have a call option feature that you would promise not to prepay for a few years at least. But after those few years are up, if you wanted to levy against the full value, so instead of levying the 30 grand a year, you're levying the 40 grand a year, and you're putting that $10,000 extra away every year. If you get to the point where you have enough cash to pay this off, we call it bond and get rid of it.
Any other questions from the council? Mark, I'm gonna ask you if you have a question. You're representing the EDA. Do you have any questions for Mike? No. Council or staff, any?
We got everything summarized the way we all gave Mike the go-ahead to go with, pending now your presentation. And then just a semantics thing, this had been planned to go to the EDA first, but because of their cancellation amongst the news, that's why we're having the rep, and then we'll still do basically a follow-up summary for the rest of the board.
So in terms of actions tonight, you're not going to take any actions that put you past the point of no return tonight. Tonight, all we're really asking is for one action. That's a resolution to call for the public hearing for the tax abatement. You can always unwind that anytime you like. The second thing is if you decide you'd like to finance this thing, you could authorize in a separate motion and vote, don't need a resolution, you could authorize staff to submit an application to Rural Water to get that done. I think I partially filled an application out for you already. One of the things we'll want to talk about is when do you want to finance that? I'm showing this thing happening kind of in line with the public hearing, but in reality, you're probably not going to be cutting them a check until
Next year.
So we don't have to decide financing now then.
Right. If you want, we could maybe look at that this fall, maybe.
And then you'll have all the answers from the bank if we want. Like the finance, Bill, how's that decided? Like through you guys or the finance committee or Carla or the council, how that's financed?
There'll be a couple avenues. We're still going to utilize the EDA's finance subcommittee,
Okay.
and then the finance committee from the council, bringing back a joint resolution or recommendation to the full council. And whether we now work on putting that together sooner and showing you the options, or like Mike said, if it's in the fall when they hopefully have the
And every
more
month,
completely.
every day really that goes by between the day we issue and then the day we cut them the check, less capitalized interest will be involved.
Yep.
Because it's less time for the interest to accrue. I want to point this out, it's not really related to your question, but in the notice, if you pass the resolution, the public notice, and we would request publication tomorrow for the next newspaper publication, you'll see in there, it talks about up to $500,000 of tax abatement over 15 years. And people might be confused when they see that in the paper and compare that to the 280 that we're talking about. And I just would take your eyes to the total payments of this. The total principal and interest is $490,000 over the life of the thing. So I just rounded up and used 500,000. It's more than likely, in fact, it's guaranteed that we're not going to levy the full 500,000. But that's why I'm covering principal and interest in the notice. I just wanted to make sure we gave ourselves enough capacity to handle unforeseen events.
If you would give a consensus at least, or not of, for the Minnesota Rural Water process. We just felt it gives it another whole set of folks that are reviewing it and working with us on it, and it's a program that's been in place for a number of years. Other people have used it, and it's worked out well. So we would, that way Mike and our staff can keep going and working on at least the application part of it.
All right, any other questions for Mike? Hearing none, I'm gonna call to approve resolution 2020 a resolution calling a public hearing on the approval of tax abatement for PGGM1 LLC, flats 55 apartments, 2020. Do we have a motion to approve?
I'll make a motion to approve.
Do we have a second?
I'll second.
We have a second. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
I,
We got an aye from Josh too, so it's unanimous. All right, the next question or consensus is, can we move along filling out the application and starting the other application for the money? Do we need a motion for that?
Let's do that.
All right, let's have a motion on that.
I'll make a motion
We have a
to start the
motion to
application
approve. Do we have a
process.
second?
I'll second.
We have a second. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
I,
Josh approved it. All against say nay. That's unanimous too. That passes also. Thank you, Mike.
Thank you very much, and when the application is submitted, I will not plan on processing that till later this year, and I'll work with staff in terms of timing on that, if that's okay with you.
Yep. Sounds good to us, and we'll get this to the paper tomorrow.
Yeah, we'll handle that request for you, so don't do that.
All right. Well, no other business on a special meeting. I look for a motion to adjourn. Do we have a second?
Second.
All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? That carries. We're adjourned.